I'm Sebastian deterding. I'm a reader at the Digital Creativity Labs at the University of York. And there I'm basically working with industry and with researchers in finding out how we can translate learnings from designing games and designing toys into other areas to make things like learning or work more enjoyable, more engaging. I've come to Amsterdam today on the invitation of a good friend of mine, Mike de Jong, who invited me here to basically tell educators a bit about how they might take learnings from game design and toy design and apply that to higher education in the creative industries. The workshop I gave was essentially twofold. The first part was about what makes games fun and engaging, particularly how they are well-structured systems or activities that give us the experience of overcoming challenges, of mastering and overcoming challenges, and how you design around that. The second part was around designing for play, that is the very particular stance with which we approach games. And there I tried to highlight that voluntariness or autonomy, the sense that I choose to do this activity, I do it for its own sake, is a core principle of play that has very many beneficial aspects and effects for learning. And the main challenge for educators, obviously, is that formal education is very often something where we have very little choice in. So how to square that is the core focus of the second part of the workshop. Games are essentially machines that produce challenges for us to overcome. Right? If you think about a Sudoku book, that's one puzzle after the other that we try to solve. If you think about a racing game, it's one round after the other that I try to beat. If you try to think about a combat game, it's one monster after the other that I try to best. The enjoyment in games comes at the moment when I, after multiple times of trying, finally managed to overcome a challenge that I wasn't able to master before. So I have the sense, oh, I now learned how to do this better. I'm now succeeding at something, right? It's the moment in bowling when I finally score a strike after previously only putting the ball into the gutter. In my talk, I differentiated between games as systems that we interact with and play as a particular kind of activity or a particular mode with which we engage in the world. And you could say similarly that in the design field around play and games, there is a distinction between playful design, which is very much about supporting playfulness as this explorative, trying out, relatively free engaging with the world, versus games that are very much around giving us clear goals, giving us clear rules, giving us clear structure, and giving us very clear feedback on how we do. So to a certain extent, the difference between free play and games about ruliness and unruliness, and between a system that is designed and the activity that we do with the system is mirrored in the distinction between gamification, which tries to add structure, game structure to things, and playful design, which tries to instill playfulness in people's behavior and perception of the world. In order to put some of the learnings of the course into practice, in the second part of the workshop we had a little design activities where the educators themselves became game designers. Now, usually if you start from zero in a certain creative practice, that's a very frightening proposition and you don't have a lot of existing skills to manage it. So a very good starting point in many creative practices, including game design, is to start with modifying something existing rather than creating something completely new from scratch. Most people that learn game design these days actually learn it because they play a game that has a level editor or something similar like that. So they start modifying the game and from there move into actually designing full-fledged games. The main purpose of having that at the end is to ground the basic concepts around how fun and enjoyment arise of how people engage with each other and how that arises from the particular rules that you design. and to give people a visceral sense and a visceral confidence in themselves that this is not something that you can plan out on a piece of paper and then it will automatically work. You have to iterate and playtest to see what kind of experience a game or any kind of rule set produces. And by going through the circle of trying that out multiple times and modifying a game, in our case musical chairs, um, the workshop participants hopefully got a bit more confidence that this is something they can do themselves once they left the workshop. I think there are three ways in which the material that the workshop covered can be implemented by educators. The one is the very direct one of asking, how can I use the iterative prototyping principle of game design as a method for instructional design? So thinking about what are small iterative changes that I can introduce to the way that I design an activity or my curriculum, see how that works, and based on that, adjust my design again. The second part is to take away what people have called the multiplayer classroom or gameful classroom. That is, a group of educators over the past 4 or 5 years have come up with a way of redesigning a total curriculum as something that approaches a game. So as something where students set themselves their own goals that they approach, they get feedback on that in terms of points that then in the end translate into grades. Students have lots of choice what they want to do at any given point in time when they enter the class. So this idea of multiplayer classrooms, as Lee Sheldon has presented it, is I think a second more direct way that you can take away. The third more indirect one is seeing how you might design any kind of educational activity in a way that is more conducive to enjoyment and motivation by taking certain basic design principles from games. So how can I support a sense of autonomy for students, even if it's a formal education where they don't necessarily have a choice whether they can sit in my course or not? Or how can I give student progress feedback on a certain skill that they might be struggling with, rather than just putting a test in front of them at the very end of the course. And then just telling them, well, that's how good or how bad you are at this, rather than getting a sense of, hey, I'm slowly getting better at this as I'm continue to working on that in the course of the class. I really enjoyed working with the group that we had. It was a very engaged and inquisitive group, and the thing that I found most, predictive of a good workshop is if already kind of 5 minutes into the workshop, people start asking you the very hard questions that you wanted to address 2 hours later into the workshop. And that definitely happened today, that 5 minutes in somebody raised their hand and they say, well, you're talking about play being a free activity. Doesn't that have an issue with educational systems which are not necessarily free? Where I said, yep, exactly, perfect. The basic point that I want to highlight to people, the workshop members themselves think along and think ahead of me, and are interested then and hooked in learning more about that. So it was a very enjoyable workshop from my perspective.